with Daniel chapter 3, you know that Daniel chapter 3 is the story of the fiery furnace. And if you're not already there in your Bibles, if you're still turning there, I'm going to start by telling you a story about a newlywed couple. The newlywed husband was sitting down at his desk and he was paying the monthly bills. And as he was going through the bills, came across the credit card bill and he noticed a charge to a department store for $250. And so he called his wife in and he said, I noticed this charge on our credit card, $250. Did you make that charge? And she said, yeah, I did. And he said, well, you know we're on a tight budget here. What'd you spend $250 on at a department store? And she said, well, I bought a dress. And he said, you bought one dress for $250. She said, yeah. He said, well, tell me the story behind how you came to buy that dress. And she said, well, it was the weirdest thing. She said, I was walking by this department store and she said, I was looking through the window at this dress. And she said, the next thing I knew, I was inside and I was trying this dress on. And she said, every time that I looked in the mirror, it was like Satan was whispering to me, you look great in this dress, you should buy it. And the husband thought for a moment, and he said, well, you should have said what Jesus said to Peter. You should have said, get behind me, Satan. And she said, well, I did, but he told me you look good from back here too. What we're talking about or going to be studying about this morning is the idea of temptation. And temptation takes many different forms. If I were to ask you the question, have you ever been tempted? And of course, as we're talking about it, we're not talking about hopefully men buying a dress, but maybe for women it might be that. But we're not talking about it in the physical realm, but we're talking about it from the idea of, have you ever been attracted to evil? Have you ever considered doing something that was wrong? Have you ever felt the pressure to do something that is wrong or is a violation of God's Word? And of course, all of us know the answer to that question is absolutely yes. In fact, the Bible teaches us that if we aren't ever tempted in our life, there's something wrong with us. The idea of the human life in the physical world is that we're going to be presented with temptations from time to time. Satan is going to try to get us to be attracted to evil or wickedness. He's going to try to get us to consider doing something that is wrong. And so it would be an anomaly. It would be something that would be out of the ordinary if we weren't tempted from time to time. The sin, when it comes to temptation, is not the idea that temptation is presented before us. Even Jesus in the flesh was tempted himself. The sin becomes when we give in to that temptation. And so the question for us and the idea that I want for us to consider this morning is not, the important thing is not that we are tempted. The important thing is that we overcome the temptation. That we don't give into it, that we don't violate God's law. And so today we want to study three men, and we're going to study it a little bit different than maybe you've looked at it before, but we're going to look at it from the standpoint of three different temptations that these men faced, but more importantly, not just the temptations that they faced, but how they overcame these temptations. And so the first thing that I want to look at is found in verses 1 through 6. And we're going to talk about how they overcame the temptation to put God second. Read along with me here. In verse 1 it says, Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits and the breadth thereof 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. I'm going to skip down to verse 3 for time's sake. It says, Then the princes, the governors and captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces were gathered together under the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then an herald cried aloud, To you it is commanded, O people, nations, and languages, that at a time when ye hear, it gives a bunch of different instruments here, and I'm going to kind of put them into modern day language so maybe you can relate a little bit to them. But when you hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, lyre, pipes, and drum, and all kinds of music, ye shall fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. And whoso falleth not down and worshipeth, shall the same hour be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. Now, if you read through, I imagine that all of us have already studied this before in some time. You know, it's a story that we study from childhood whenever we go to Bible class. But it's interesting to me when you look at this decree that Nebuchadnezzar made. Do you know what you will not find in this decree? You will not find a statement where he said you cannot worship Jehovah God. There was nothing in this where that strictly forbid the worshiping of Jehovah God. Now, there were some, you might say, well, if you get technically, it really did. Well, you could say that, but what I'm saying is this. Nebuchadnezzar didn't just come out and say, you can't worship Jehovah God. That wasn't what the decree was. The decree was, at a certain time, when you hear all these different instruments, your job, your duty, the commandment is this, that you're going to fall down and you're going to worship this golden statue. And so, think about it from the standpoint, I was kind of thinking about as I put this lesson together, over the ages of mankind and the history of mankind, some of the tyrannical governments that have been in power in the world today. It's kind of interesting when you think about it because they operated a lot on the same principle that Nebuchadnezzar did. Now, not every world empire did that, but a lot of them did. And basically, their idea was, if you're going to advance in our nation, if you're going to progress in our nation, then you have to do whatever we tell you. And if you do what we tell you to do, no matter what that might be, then again, you'll advance up the ladder. And of course, ultimately, it would be you'll stay alive. Think about, though, just the history of mankind and some of the governments that have kind of put that idea or principle into practice. And it's not always a commandment where it says you can't have any god or any religion except the government. It's not that they strictly forbid the worshiping of other idols or of other gods or even of Jehovah God himself. But it was the case that as long as you show loyalty to this nation, as long as you make this nation and this government your priority, you can serve whatever God you want. You can have whatever religion you want, just as long as it takes second place to the state. And so you kind of have that principle laid down here by Nebuchadnezzar. It's not a command that he issued where he said, you can't worship any other god, or you can't have any other religion. It's not like you read about with Daniel in the lion's den, where you can't talk to any other person or ask anything of anybody except the king. It's nothing like that, where it strictly forbids the participation or the worship of any other god. It was just this decree, this is what has to happen. This has got to be your priority. When you hear the music, you worship this golden statue. And so I was thinking about, that idea and thinking about the nation that we live in today. Again, like all these lessons, we want to make them as practical as we can. But what is the decree in America? And I know a lot of people are going to be sitting there saying, well, we don't have anything like that, We don't have a decree like Nebuchadnezzar passed that said you got to fall down, you got to worship this statue, and if you don't do this, you're going to be thrown into a burning fiery furnace. And that's true. I mean, we don't have any decree like that our physical lives in this nation, that our physical lives are in jeopardy if we don't prioritize government and prioritize the state. But I want you to think about and ask yourself this question. Is there pressure that's put upon us as Christians today to put God second in our lives? Is there pressure that is exerted upon us to take a back seat, or to allow God and His teachings and His Word to take a back seat, to prioritize other things before that? And I think the answer is yes. Now, the approach is much more subtle today than it was in the days of Nebuchadnezzar. But if you look at our society as a whole, there's the pressure and the idea to keep your religious beliefs private, right? Don't bring your religious ideas and beliefs to work, right? Don't go out here in the public and start talking about Christ and start preaching the gospel. you can be a Christian. You can serve God, but you do it in the own privacy of your home. You keep what you believe and what you teach to yourselves. And so you have this pressure to keep the public sphere untainted from any religion. There's a thing that's often brought up when you talk about religion and government and nations and societies, in our world at least, and it's this thing called the separation of church and state. You ever heard that before? Now, I'm not going to go into a comprehensive discourse about our Constitution or about any statements that have been made by our forefathers. But basically, this idea in principle states this, and this is why it was put, the idea was put within the framework of our leaders, our political leaders. It was, they did not want the government to have the power to force people to observe a certain religion. And so it had nothing to do with the idea you couldn't talk about religion. It had nothing to do with the idea that you couldn't be a Christian in public. It had everything to do with the idea that we don't want a government that has the power to enforce a religion, a universal religion upon other people. And so the idea is when it comes to religious matters, the government was going to stay neutral. They weren't going to show any favor. Now I want you to think about that and think about the way that phrase is used in our separation of church and state, that it's used in our society today. And basically, Dennis talked about it a little bit this morning. Basically, there's been a movement because of that to push God out of everything, right? You got to have the church and the state separate. That means you can't have God intrude in any part. You can't even mention God when it comes to government, it comes to laws and things like that. And so we see it within our school systems. And I know it's not every school system. I don't want people to think that I think every public school system tries to indoctrinate people. I know in our areas we're blessed to have certain school systems that don't do that. But don't pull the wool over our own eyes too. Because 90% of the world isn't like our little neck of the woods over here. But what do you have within the public school system? You go into the realm of science, and basically here's what they've said. You can teach any and every hypothesis when it comes to how this world was created, except intelligent design. Can't teach that. I was reading an article the other day. It wasn't from a publication of the Lord's Church. It was a denominational publication. But it was a preacher within a denomination whose son was taking part in a study hall. And they literally set the kids down when they went into that study hall, public school system, and they said this: you can read any book in this class that you want except the Bible. Now, does that seem like the government's not showing any favor to anybody? Does it seem like it's not taking any sides, that it's remaining neutral? That doesn't sound like the idea at all. It sounds like what they're trying to do is say, you put God second. Okay, you can think anything you want to think. You can bring up any hypothesis that you want to bring up in science, but don't talk to us about God. You believe in God, that's good. You take that home, you leave it behind your doors. You want to read the Bible? That's fine. Just don't bring it into the school system. Leave it at home. That's not what the separation of church and state was all about. But you have this idea, this same principle, this same pressure within our society to put God second. Now, thankfully, we're not shot because of it if we don't observe it. Thankfully, we're not thrown into a fiery furnace. And, you know, I understand we still have a remarkable amount of freedom in this country, and I'm grateful for it. I'm thankful that we do. But realistically, we still feel the same pressure that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego felt. And that is the pressure to put the demands of our God in second place. It's not that they say you can't be a Christian, you can't read the Bible, you can't do what you want to do. They just said, put the government's priority first. When we tell you to do this, this is what you do. And that's basically the same concept you read about here. So they overcame this temptation to put God second. Government said, you do this at this point in time because it violated God's law. And that's what I want to emphasize. Acts 5:28 and 29. because it was a violation of God's law to serve or to worship idols, these three men could not participate in it. They could not put that law of the land, make it a priority. Now, if it hadn't violated God's law, that would have been fine. But that's what made it wrong. The second temptation that I want us to think about is they overcame the temptation to bow down to an idol. And if you notice in verse 7, I always find it interesting sometimes when I read through these stories, because you get like this collective idea of the story, and then all of a sudden the narrator kind of says, well, I forgot to mention this, you know. And so read verse 7 with me, and notice the impression that you get there. It says, therefore at the time when all the people heard the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, lyre, pipes, and all kinds of music, all the people, the nations, and the languages fell down and worshipped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. So when you read that, at first it seems like, you know, everything went exactly like Nebuchadnezzar had planned. This statue was accomplishing its purpose. You know, all these people who were here were representatives of, like it says, all people and all nations and all different languages that were present under the rule of the Babylonian Empire. And so you have the whole world in this single act of submission. For a whole moment, it seems like the kingdom is united, bowing down to this statue. But then you start reading in verse 8, and it's like the narrator says, oh, wait a minute, I forgot to add this minor detail, you know. All people, all nations, all languages bowed down to the statue. But in verse 8 it says, wherefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came near and accused the Jews. They spake and said to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. Thou, O king, hast made a decree that every man shall hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, lyre, pipes, and drums, and all kinds of music, shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoso falleth not down and worshipeth, that he should be cast in the midst of a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom thou set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not regarded thee. They serve not thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. And so we have this picture while the whole world here is busy bowing down before the idol. There's a very small group, 3 individuals that we read about here, who resisted the decree to bow down to this idol. Now, I want us to stop for just a moment here, and I want you to view this, what's happening here, from the standpoint of Nebuchadnezzar, because a lot of times we read these stories, and, you know, we just think about them solely from a godly perspective. But stop for a moment and think how Nebuchadnezzar viewed this. Okay, here he is. He's this powerful king of a world empire. And he passes this law, and the law states that everybody has to do this. And so it's brought to your attention that almost everybody did. But there were 3 Jews who he had appointed over a lot of the affairs of Babylon who did not obey the commandment of the king. And so it's really, from Nebuchadnezzar's standpoint, it's disrespectful to his authority. You know, it's a disregard for him being king of this land and for the laws that he's passed. And so ask yourself this question. How do kings respond to disobedience? I mean, I can't think, as you read through the Bible, I can't think of any king who responded favorably to disobedience. Can you? I can't think of anybody that you read about where, you know, they disobeyed a law that a king made, and he came to him and he said, good job, you know. Oh, we need more men and women like you. That just doesn't happen. And so when you think of what is Nebuchadnezzar going to do, talked about it, I think it was last week that we talked about it, or the week before. My memory is not what it used to be, Dennis, but we talked about the idea how the king is, Nebuchadnezzar is, when he gets mad, he's out of control. I mean, there's just no reasoning with it. And so Nebuchadnezzar is going to respond in one of the weirdest ways that I've ever seen a person in power respond. We'll talk maybe, Lord willing, more about that tonight. So But what does all this mean? Well, they would not bow down to his idol. And so what do we learn about this? What we learn is if we are not going to bow down to idols, a lot of times that means you're going to be standing by yourself. Now I know that literally when you read about these men, you say, well, there were 3 of them. Yeah, there were. And that's good. That's a great lesson, I think, in and of itself. If you want to stand up for what's right, and especially I think this is a great lesson for our young people here, surround yourself with people who are going to do what's right. It's not going to be easy, but it's going to be easier if there's 2 of you more than 1. It's going to be easier if there's 3 of you more than 1. So if you want to do what's right, surround yourself with people who are going to do what's right too. But that often means having to stand by yourself. And think about all the Bible says all people and all nations and all languages bowed down. How many people were there? I don't know. But I do know that there were only 3 that we read about that did not bow down to this statue. And if you don't think felt like you were standing alone in the midst of this great crowd when you were only 3 standing up, I don't know what would make you feel like you were alone. There's a commandment in the Old Testament, and it's still an application for us under the New Testament today. But God had a law in the Old Testament, Exodus 23 and verse 2. And that law was this: thou shalt not follow a multitude to do evil. It doesn't matter how many people do something, it doesn't make it right. And I know a lot of times as individuals we say, well, everybody else was doing it, What if everybody else bowed down to that idol? Did that make bowing down to the idol right all of a sudden? Did it change God's perspective on things since the majority of the people were doing what was wrong? No, it was still wrong in the sight of God. And I want to emphasize again what he's talking about, Exodus 23 and verse 2 there, following a multitude. He's talking about doing the popular thing, right? Doing what the majority of the people do. Even though they do something that's wrong, that doesn't give us permission. That doesn't give us God's consent to go ahead and participate in that evil with them. And so understand that what these 3 men did, it was not the popular thing to do. And generally speaking, doing what's right, it's not going to be the popular thing to do. I mean, there are a few times when you read through the Bible when we might say the majority of the people did what was right. Very few, but usually it is not the popular thing to do. And so what does that mean? That means if you're going to do what's right, you're going to have to stand by yourself. You're going to have to be willing to stand out in a crowd. We have to understand, it doesn't matter how large or small a human crowd is. That doesn't influence, again, God's decision of what is right or what is wrong. The most important thing that we have to think about when we're thinking about the audience that's looking at us, a lot of times we say, well, millions of people, are watching us. Well, that could be true. But there's somebody else who's watching you that's more important than all those millions of people. And that is God. And what God sees and what God thinks is more important than what the majority of mankind thinks and what they do. And so it often means, if we're not going to bow down to idols, it often means we're going to have to stand by ourselves. The second thing that I want to emphasize is bowing down to an idol is probably going to seem like the best thing to do. And I'm talking about that from purely a physical standpoint. Because if you were to look at these men and their physical circumstances and everything that was happening, and you were to sit down and to calculate things out, what was the best thing for them to do? The best thing for them to do would have been to bow down to that idol, right? And so we have this command in the New Testament. The Apostle John writes in 1 John 5 and verse 21, very, very short verse, but he says, my little children, keep yourself from idols. Don't bow down to idols. Now, we could spend some time discussing, well, was John talking about these physical statues or was he not? But we all know that an idol can be more than just a physical statue. An idol is anything that takes the place of God. It's anything that becomes our priority in life. It's anything that we put in front of or before God. And so it could be our physical pleasure. It could be desires that we have in this life. It could be adapting a certain attitude that society tells us, if you don't have this attitude, you're not going to have a fulfilled life. You're not going to live a life that's worthwhile here upon this earth. And you have these promises from a physical perspective. If you bow down to this idol, things are going to be good for you, right? If you don't, things are going to be bad. And so even though we're not, when we think about idols today, generally, as Christians, we're not talking solely about a physical statue, although I should emphasize it does include physical statues, but we're not talking solely about physical statues. We're talking about anything that we would place before God. And so what is the world, or what do they say? They say, bow down to this image, and if you bow down to this image, you'll be all right. If you don't, you'll be thrown into a fiery furnace. Now, again, think about the pressure that was on Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to bow down to this literal idol. I almost feel ashamed likening it to the pressure that's on us today to bow down to our pleasures or our desires or even the attitudes that society wants us to adapt. Because there's no gun that's being held to our head. You know, there's no situation that we're in here in America today where somebody says, if you don't do what you desire, then I'm going to blow your brains out. You know, that's not the situation at all. And it's almost get embarrassed, I guess be the right word, when we start comparing our situation to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Because if we, the pressure that we're under today, if we buckle and bow under the smallest amount of pressure that we're under today to bow down to the idols of our lives, think about what these men did literally with death, you know, being a reality for them, being a threat to them. And there's no way to compare it except like we would think of today. Now, I've said before, I'd like to think that I'd have the same courage and faith that these guys would have. We read these examples in the Bible a lot. We say, oh yeah, I'd do that, you know, no problem. I'd be just like those people. But I've also often said when I heard that music, I'd probably look down at my sandal and see my latchet was loose, and I'd bend down there and tighten it up, you know. I'd probably, in my human mind, I would try to figure out some way, you know, to escape this possibility. Because it seems like that's the best thing to do for me. While it seems like the best thing to do is to bow down to an idol, you know, that's what's going to give you happiness and that's what's going to bring you pleasure, the reality of it is, in the long run, it's not. And so these men overcame that temptation to bow down to an idol. The third temptation that I want to talk about is they overcame the temptation to save themselves, to save their own life. And here's what I want to emphasize as we go through this section. You know, the scriptures teach us that in reality we're to be willing to sacrifice anything and everything for the cause of Christ. That includes our own life. But there's always, as a human being, there's always this desire to put value on your human life, your physical life, above everything else, even service to God. And so what I want to emphasize as we go through this section is understand this. If we're going to be willing to put God first and to put His commandments first in our life, there's going to be some consequences that come along with it. And you read about that here in this story. Notice in verse 13, it says, Then Nebuchadnezzar in his rage and fury commanded to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar spake and said unto them, Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Do not ye serve my gods, nor worship the golden image which I have set up? Now if ye be ready, that at what time ye hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, lyre, pipes, and drums, and all kinds of music, ye fall down and worship the image which I have made, well, or it will be well. But if ye do not worship, you will be cast the same hour into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and He will deliver us out of thy hand, O king. But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. Again, I want to emphasize verse 18. Remember, these people come up to Nebuchadnezzar and they tell him, Everybody bowed down when they heard this music except 3 guys, 3 Jews. And how does he react? Well, in verse 13, King James Version says, Nebuchadnezzar in his rage and in his fury. Can you picture this? He becomes enraged at this idea. These guys have the very gall to defy me and to defy my authority, and defy this nation, and defy this law that I put into effect. And so in his mind, he's saying this. He sets up this final choice. He brings them in, and he says, listen, when you hear the music, you guys bow down. And if you bow down, he knew these were valuable assets to the kingdom of Babylon. He didn't want to just wipe them off. He said, I'll give you the second chance, okay? I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. And here's what he thought in his mind. He thought, when I bring them in front of me, and I give them this ultimatum, they're going to do what I tell them to do. They're going to be scared out of their wits. You know, they're going to be scared out of their mind, and they are going to do what I commanded them to do, and everything's going to be fine in the kingdom. Well, as we read on, we of course know that these men, he basically told them, you're going to bow down or you're going to burn up. It's your choice. He thought that was going to work. Everything was going to go back to the way it was before. But here's what these 3 men say. Nebuchadnezzar challenged the ability of their God. He said, what God is going to save you from this fiery furnace? Is that God you're wanting to stand up for? Is he going to be able to deliver you out of this? And in their minds, the ability of God was never a question. You know, they didn't doubt the ability of God. I think Dennis kind of mentioned it in our class this morning. When the early church prayed, did they believe in God's power and ability? Yeah. The question is not if, as Christians, a lot of time when we pray to God, it's not a question of if God can do this. It's not a question of his ability or his hand being shortened or his ear that he's deaf, he can't hear us. That's not what the question is about. The question is this God's will? And that was a question they couldn't answer. Can God deliver you? Yeah, he can deliver me. If he does, we'll stand here and talk to you, King. But if he doesn't, we don't know what God's will is in this matter. That's the unknown. If he doesn't understand this, it's not going to change our mind. We're not going to bow down and worship this image, even if it means we're going to die. And so God's decision was not going to affect their decision to bow. Now, were there consequences because of that? Yes. Notice verse 19. It says, then was Nebuchadnezzar full of fury. We already read he was mad, right? He's already full of wrath and rage and anger, but now he's consumed with it. The Bible says he is full of fury, and the form, the King James Version says, the form of his visage was changed. Now, understand the meaning of that. I was trying to think about how some of the other versions translates it. I think one of them says the countenance of his face changed. Husbands, you can appreciate this a little bit. But have you ever said something to your wife unfiltered, and the moment you say it, you see her face change, and you think, that was not smart, right? That was not a good decision. You can see that the attitude, the atmosphere has changed. There was something on the face of Nebuchadnezzar. One version says his face was purple with anger. There was something about his appearance that changed whenever Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said, we don't know what God's going to do. God can deliver us, but understand this, we don't care, because we're not bowing down to this statue. Then the appearance of Nebuchadnezzar changed. And so he speaks in verse 19, and he commands that they should heat the furnace 7 times more than it was wont to be heated. I don't understand. We'll talk a little bit more about that tonight, though, Lord willing. And he commanded the most mighty men that was in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their coats, their hosen, and their hats, and other garments, and were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. What happened to them when they stood up against the idols? There were consequences, weren't there? And what we have to understand is if we are going to stand up for what's right, if we're not going to save ourselves, there are going to be some consequences that we're going to have to suffer. It may be persecution. It may be prison, like we read about. It may be verbal assault. It may be literally the giving of our physical life. But there are going to be some kind of consequences that are attached to that decision. And so as humans, we better be prepared for that. Mentally, we better prepare ourselves. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said, we don't know what's going to happen. But they knew this, didn't they? They knew that if God chose not to deliver them, they were going to die in that fiery furnace. And they came to grips with that. I mean, they were willing to go through that. So be prepared for the consequences. And then the last thing that I want you to think about here as we end. Think about the irony that's involved in this story. If you're not familiar with the word irony, and we use it a lot in our society, but it means when what you expect to happen is exactly the opposite. Okay, so think about what was expected to happen. Well, read verse 22. It says, therefore, because the king's commandment was urgent, and the furnace exceeding hot, the flame of the fire slew those men that took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down bound in the midst of the burning fiery furnace. We know the rest of the story, right? What happened to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Nothing. You know what happened to these three men that tried to throw them into the fire? They died. Now that's exactly the opposite of what Nebuchadnezzar was expecting. And as you read this story, all those people who fell down and worshiped that idol, they should have lived, right? That was the expectation. The only people who should have died in this story were the three people who refused to stand up or bow down to the idols. Thought about the words of Jesus in Mark 8 and verse 35. He says this. Think about the irony in this statement. He says, for whosoever will save his life shall lose it. But whosoever shall lose his life for my sake in the Gospels, the same shall save it. What do you think of when you think about losing your life? Do you think about salvation, deliverance? Jesus said, if you lose your life for my sake, you will be saved. You will be delivered. If you don't lose your life, if you don't sacrifice your life here upon this earth, you might say, well, I saved myself. He said, no, you're going to die. Think about the irony. The irony of that statement cannot be overemphasized. In saving, we lose, and in losing, we save. It's not the way of the world, but it is the way of God. They overcame the temptation to save themselves. Now, I want us to recap all these things that we've talked about. All of us, we started out with this, all of us are going to face temptation. That's just humanity. That's just this world. The important thing is not that we're going to face temptation. The important thing is that we overcome it. And remember the example of these three men, the temptation that they overcame. They overcame the temptation to put God second. You know, Satan's smart, guys. He knows that he doesn't have to get us to completely abandon God. You know what he just has to get us to do? Put God second. He doesn't care if we're a Christian as long as we're a Christian in the privacy of our home. He doesn't care if we worship God as long as we don't bring that into the public atmosphere. Don't make God a priority. Put him second in your life. And if Satan can get us to do that, he's plenty happy. He wants us to put our family before God. He wants us to put our job before God. He wants us to put our own personal happiness before God. He wants us to put our country before God. Anything except God. They overcame that temptation to put God second. They overcame the temptation to bow down to an idol. What does that mean? That means that you're going to have to be willing to stand up alone. Sometimes I tell my children, they probably get tired of hearing it, but it's generally when they don't do what they're supposed to do. And sometimes in the public setting, I said, listen, being a Christian is not doing what everybody else does. Being a Christian is standing up for right no matter what. Amen. Being willing to stand alone when everybody else does what's wrong. That was these three men, guys. They were willing to stand alone. That's what being a Christian is all about. It's about honoring God when other people won't. It's going to seem like physically the best thing to do is bow down to an idol, right? It's going to seem like physically, everybody's going to like me. People are going to get along with me. Society is going to accept me. If I bow down to this idol, everything's going to be better for me. That's not the reality of the situation. They overcame the third temptation to save themselves. And listen, if we are not going to save ourselves, you have to be prepared to accept the consequences that come with that. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were. And remember the irony of that situation. Because what the world is going to tell us is you're going to lose your life if you don't do what I tell you to do. But in reality, we're going to gain life. They're going to tell us exactly the opposite of what's going to happen to us. Well, there's a lot more that could be said. I hope you will come back and join us tonight, though. I'm looking forward to tonight's study.